Hey everyone, welcome back to CreepyCorner Stories. You know, diving into the dark web is always risky, but sharing these stories with you makes it worth it. I'm curious, where are you watching this from right now? Let me know in the comments below. I've noticed that these kinds of stories hit differently depending on where you are. It might even make the experience a little creepier. So, tell me, are you watching from the safety of your home or somewhere less secure? I found a dark web stream from an alleged NASA feed. The stream showed an object approaching Earth that isn't a satellite. Okay, before I even start, let me just say this. I'm not some deep web mastermind. I'm just your average 20-something guy who spends too much time online. I don't usually mess around with sketchy stuff. I like my bank account intact, thank you very much. But curiosity is a hell of a drug, you know. This whole thing started because I was bored. Like end of Netflix queue, bored. My friends flaked on me for the third Friday in a row, so I was home alone, scrolling through TikTok and listening to the same 5 songs on Spotify. After about an hour of staring at my phone, I thought, why not do something different? That's when the stupid idea hit me. I could explore the deep web. Now, before you judge, hear me out. I wasn't planning to do anything illegal. I wasn't trying to buy drugs, hire a hitman, or anything like that. I just wanted to explore. You know, find one of those creepy mystery forums or stumble across some obscure conspiracy theory. It sounded harmless enough. So, I fired up Tor, threw on a VPN because I'm not that reckless, and started poking around. Most of it was pretty underwhelming. Old forums, dead links, random sites selling questionable, rare artifacts. I was about ready to call it a night when I found it. The link didn't have a title or description, just one line of text in plain white font. Not all broadcasts are meant for the public. Obviously, I clicked it. I mean, who wouldn't? The page it loaded was super basic, just a black screen with an embedded video player. No ads, no chat box, no user interface. The stream was already live. At first, it looked like nothing special. The footage was grainy, almost like old CCTV. It showed what looked like a control room, the kind you see in NASA documentaries. There were a few people walking around in the background, all wearing those lanyards you see on engineers and mission specialists. I was about to close the tab, figuring it was just some random leaked feed from NASA or SpaceX. But then I noticed something on one of the monitors in the background. It wasn't a satellite. It wasn't a meteor either. It was something else. On the screen, I could see space, black, infinite, with tiny pinpricks of starlight scattered across it. And in the middle of the frame was this massive, jagged object. At first, I thought it was just a chunk of space debris, maybe an old satellite or some kind of asteroid. But the longer I watched, the less sense that made. For one, it was huge, like way bigger than anything I'd ever seen in orbit. If I had to guess, I'd say it was the size of a skyscraper, or bigger. And its shape, it wasn't natural. It was sharp and angular, almost like a giant shard of glass or obsidian. I leaned closer to my screen, trying to make out the details, but the feed quality was terrible. Every few seconds it would pixelate, and the colors would blur. Still, I could tell there was something off about it. It wasn't spinning or drifting like you'd expect from space debris. It was moving. And not just moving, it was tilting, almost like it was looking for something. At this point, I was glued to my screen. I couldn't look away. The people in the control room were moving around frantically, pacing back and forth and pointing at the monitor. There was no audio, but you didn't need to hear them to know they were panicking. One guy was practically slamming his fist on a desk, and a woman standing next to him was gesturing wildly, like she was trying to explain something urgent. I started to feel uneasy. The atmosphere in the room, even through a screen, was tense. These weren't people calmly monitoring a routine event. They were freaked out. I glanced at the time in the corner of my laptop. It was 2:37 a.m. I should have gone to bed, but I couldn't pull myself away. Something about that shard, because that's what it looked like, a shard of something, felt wrong, like on a deep gut level. Then the camera zoomed in on the object, and that's when I saw it wasn't just a solid black mass. There were patterns on it. Faint, intricate lines crisscrossed its surface, like carvings or etchings. They almost looked like symbols, but they were too distorted to make out. I leaned in, squinting at my screen, trying to figure out if I was imagining it. Was it some kind of alien craft? A piece of a destroyed satellite? A secret government project? My mind was racing with possibilities when the stream suddenly glitched. For a split second, the screen went black. When the video came back, the camera was closer, way closer. The object filled almost the entire frame now, and I could see those patterns more clearly. They weren't random. They were deliberate. That's when the feed cut to black again. I sat there, staring at the blank screen, my heart pounding. I thought maybe the stream had gone offline, but after a few seconds, white text appeared on the screen. Connection interrupted. Attempting to re-establish. My laptop fans started whirring like crazy, louder than they'd ever been before. I didn't know if it was just my imagination, but it felt like the room got colder. I rubbed my arms, staring at the message, waiting for the feed to come back. And then something weird happened. A text box popped up on my screen. It wasn't part of the browser. It was an external window, like when you get a system notification. It said, "You shouldn't be here. Leave now." The message froze me. It wasn't just the words. It was the timing, the bluntness, and the fact that it didn't feel like some random error. It felt personal. "You shouldn't be here. Leave now." I stared at the text box, half expecting it to vanish, or for my computer to blue screen or something. But no, it just sat there, glaring at me in cold, plain font. My stomach twisted. Something knew I was watching. I clicked X to close the box, but it wouldn't budge. I tried Alt F4. Nothing. Then my screen flickered again, and the stream came back. But this time, it wasn't showing the control room. The camera had been moved. Now, the feed was zoomed in on the object, close enough to see every detail of those carvings on its surface. And holy shit, they weren't just random scratches or markings. They were symbols, but not like anything I'd ever seen before. They looked ancient, alien, and somehow alive. The lines twisted and pulsed, as if they were moving on their own. I swear I could almost hear them, like a faint hum just at the edge of my hearing. That's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. The shard wasn't stationary anymore. It was moving faster now, tilting and rotating like it was scanning something or someone. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just some chunk of debris floating harmlessly in space. It was looking. I glanced at the text box again, still sitting stubbornly in the corner of my screen. The words hadn't changed. You shouldn't be here. Leave now. That was all the warning I needed. I yanked the power cord out of my laptop and slammed the lid shut, my hands shaking. For a few seconds, I just sat there in the dark, listening to the hum of my fridge and the faint whoosh of cars passing outside. Then my phone buzzed. I nearly jumped out of my skin. When I grabbed it, I saw it was just a Twitter notification, a random post about some celebrity breakup I didn't care about. But then, a second notification popped up, and then a third, and then a fourth. At first, I thought it was some glitch, but when I looked closer, my stomach dropped. Every notification was the same, a direct message. Each one had the same text. You shouldn't be here. Leave now. I fumbled to open the app, but before I could even log in, my screen went black. Not just the phone screen. The entire thing shut off, like the battery had been yanked. My heart was racing now. I tried turning it back on, but it wouldn't respond. I stared at the dead phone in my hands, a million questions racing through my head. Was someone hacking me? Was it just some messed up coincidence? I mean, the deep web is full of trolls, right? Maybe I'd accidentally clicked into some elaborate prank. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The thing about fear is, it makes you notice stuff you'd normally ignore. Like how my apartment, which had been cozy and familiar just a few hours ago, now felt wrong. The shadows seemed darker. The air felt heavier. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I decided to power my laptop back on, just to make sure everything was fine. But when I opened it, my stomach sank. The stream was still there. I hadn't reconnected to the internet. Hell, I hadn't even plugged the damn thing back in. But somehow, the feed was playing again, full screen, as if I'd never closed it. The object was closer now, practically filling the frame. The symbols on its surface were glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. And then, for the first time, the audio came through. It wasn't static or background noise. It was a voice. A low, distorted voice that sounded like it was speaking from underwater. The words were garbled, but I could make out a few phrases. Approaching. Imminent. Not human. Not safe. Earth. The voice cut out abruptly, and the camera shifted again. Now, it wasn't focused on the object. It was pointed back at the control room. But something had changed. The people were gone. The room was empty, but the chairs were overturned, and papers were scattered across the desks. On one of the monitors, there was a map of Earth with a red line stretching across it, like a trajectory. The line ended somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, and then I saw it. In the reflection of one of the monitors, there was something standing in the room. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I nearly choked. Whatever was in that room wasn't human. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its limbs were wrong. Too long, too thin, like stretched out shadows. Its head was tilted toward the camera, but I couldn't see its face. Just a dark, featureless void where its features should have been. It moved, not like a person, but like something that didn't quite understand how movement worked. It jerked forward, almost as if it was glitching, and its head twitched toward the camera. The stream cut out again. This time, when the screen went black, no text popped up. No reconnecting message, no warning, just darkness. My laptop fan was still going, loud enough to fill the silence, but the feed didn't come back. And then, just when I thought it was over, I heard a knock at my door. It was slow, deliberate. 3 loud knocks, perfectly spaced apart. I froze. No one knocks on my door at 3 a.m., especially not in my neighborhood. I sat there, clutching the edge of my desk, listening. Another knock. My first thought was to call the police, but my phone was still dead. I considered looking through the peephole, but something in my gut told me not to. Another knock, louder this time. I finally worked up the nerve to whisper, "Who is it?" No answer. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard it. A voice, low and raspy, coming from the other side of the door. "You shouldn't be here." The voice on the other side of the door wasn't right. It sounded human, but there was something off about it, like someone trying to imitate how a person speaks, but getting the timing just a little wrong. It was low, gravelly, and seemed to echo, even though there was nothing for it to bounce off of. "You shouldn't be here." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just sat there, gripping the edge of my desk so tightly, my knuckles turned white. The silence that followed was worse than the knocking. It felt like the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for me to do something. Then came the sound I'll never forget. It wasn't footsteps. It wasn't the creak of the floorboards outside my door. It was a scraping sound, like nails dragging down metal, slow and deliberate. My apartment door is solid wood, but whatever was out there, it was clawing at it like it was trying to get inside. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. Instead, I did the dumbest thing I could possibly do. I stood up. My legs felt like they were made of jelly, but I managed to shuffle toward the door. The scraping stopped. I froze. My heartbeat was so loud, I could hear it pounding in my ears, and for a second, I thought I was about to faint. But then I heard it again. 3 slow knocks, and this time, the voice was closer. "You shouldn't be here." It wasn't just coming from outside anymore. It was inside my head. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. I was dreaming. I had to be. Maybe I'd fallen asleep while watching the stream, and my brain was just mixing everything together into some bizarre nightmare. That had to be it, right? But then the scraping started again, and I knew this wasn't a dream. It moved around the edge of the door, slow and deliberate, like it was tracing the frame. And then, God, I swear, I'm not making this up, I saw the doorknob start to turn. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted for the bathroom, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My bathroom's tiny, barely big enough to fit the tub, sink, and toilet, but it felt safer than the rest of my apartment. I sat on the edge of the tub, clutching my phone even though I knew it was dead. I kept waiting for the sound of the door opening, for footsteps, for whatever was out there to come inside. But nothing happened. For a few minutes, it was dead silent. And then, out of nowhere, I heard a click. It was faint, barely audible, but I knew exactly what it was. It was the sound of my laptop turning on. I wanted to ignore it, to stay hidden in the bathroom until morning, but the curiosity that got me into this mess was still eating at me. I cracked the bathroom door open just a sliver, enough to peek out into the hallway. The apartment was dark, but I could see the faint glow of the laptop screen from my bedroom. The stream was still running. I didn't want to go back in there. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to stay put. But something, God, I don't know what, pushed me forward. I crept down the hallway, my socks barely making a sound against the hardwood floor. When I reached my bedroom, I stopped in the doorway. The stream had changed. The control room was back, but now it was completely trashed. The monitors were smashed, the desks overturned, and the walls were smeared with something dark, something that looked a hell of a lot like blood. But that wasn't the worst part. In the middle of the room, standing perfectly still, was the thing I'd seen earlier in the reflection. It was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, and its limbs were impossibly long, almost like they'd been stretched. Its skin, if you could call it that, was gray and slick, like wet clay, and its face, it didn't have one. Where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was just a smooth, featureless surface, but somehow I could feel it looking at me. The thing raised one of its spindly arms and pointed, not at the camera, at me. The feed cut out again, replaced by the same text as before. "You shouldn't be here. Leave now." This time, though, the message didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a threat. I backed away from the laptop, my chest heaving. My legs hit the bed, and I nearly collapsed onto it. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. The window. It was open. I never open my windows. I live on the 5th floor, and the last thing I need is a pigeon flying in, or my idiot self dropping something out of it. But now, the window was wide open, the curtains fluttering in the breeze. I stepped closer, peering out into the darkness. For a moment, I didn't see anything, just the usual view of the alley below. But then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were handprints on the glass. They weren't mine. They were huge, with fingers that stretched impossibly long, and they were pressed against the outside of the window. Whatever had been knocking on my door, it had been here too. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Call the police. What would I even tell them? "Hi, officer. I think I'm being stalked by some faceless space monster I found on a NASA stream." Yeah, that'd go over well. Then my phone buzzed. I nearly dropped it, but somehow it had turned back on. The screen lit up, and for a second, I thought everything was fine, until I saw the notification. It was a message from an unknown number. No name, no profile picture, just the words, "Look outside." I didn't want to. Every instinct told me to stay away from the window, but something made me do it anyway. I walked over, my legs trembling, and looked down at the alley. At first, it was empty. Just a few dumpsters and the flickering streetlight that always buzzed late at night. And then I saw it. Standing under the light, staring up at my window, was the thing from the stream. It raised its hand and waved. It waved at me. The movement wasn't friendly. It was mocking, slow, and deliberate, like it knew exactly what it was doing. Its impossibly long fingers curled and uncurled in a motion that felt wrong. It wasn't just the shape of its hand, though that alone was enough to make my stomach churn. It was how it moved, like each joint was slightly out of sync with the rest, bending in ways no human joint could. My mind screamed at me to step back from the window, but my body refused to cooperate. I stood there, frozen, staring down at the thing in the alley. The faint, flickering light above it only made it worse. Every time the bulb buzzed and dimmed, the creature's features, or lack thereof, seemed to shift, like its form was struggling to stay anchored in reality. Then it did something I still can't fully explain. It tilted its head, not like a person would, but in a way that suggested it was listening. And then, with a horrible, jerky motion, it pointed up, directly at me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My first instinct was to slam the window shut, but as I reached for it, I froze. The handprints, those massive, unnatural handprints that had been pressed against the glass earlier, they were gone. The glass was clean, as if they'd never been there. I stood there, my hand hovering near the window latch, trying to make sense of it. Then the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the window. I spun around so fast, I almost lost my balance. I hadn't seen it move. I didn't hear it climb. But somehow, impossibly, the thing was there, outside my 5th-story window, clinging to the glass like a spider. Its hand was pressed against the glass, its fingers splayed wide, each one longer than my forearm. The smooth, featureless surface of its face was inches from the window pane, tilted slightly, as if it were examining me. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at it, but eventually, the thing moved. Slowly, almost casually, it dragged its hand down the glass, the sound sharp and grating, like nails on a chalkboard. The patterns on its skin, or whatever the hell that surface was, seemed to shift and ripple with the movement, forming shapes that looked disturbingly familiar. And then I realized why. They were the same symbols I'd seen on the shard. I don't know what possessed me to speak, but the words came out before I could stop them. "What do you want?" For a second, nothing happened. The thing just stayed there, motionless, its faceless head tilted toward me. Then, slowly, it raised one of its long, spindly fingers and tapped the glass. Once, twice. On the 3rd tap, it whispered. I don't know how I heard it through the glass, but I did. The sound wasn't like the garbled voice from the stream. It was clear, sharp, and somehow worse. "You shouldn't be here." The words echoed in my head, louder than they should have been. I stumbled back, clutching my temples, and that's when the glass shattered. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched screech that felt like it was tearing through my skull. I hit the floor, my ears ringing, shards of glass raining down around me. When I looked up, the thing was gone. The alley was empty again. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe the creature had vanished, retreating back to wherever the hell it came from. But then I heard it again. The voice. It wasn't coming from the window this time. It was coming from inside the apartment. "You shouldn't be here." The words were softer now, almost a whisper, but they sent a wave of cold terror through me. I scrambled to my feet, glass crunching under my socks, and grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, an old metal desk lamp. The apartment was silent, save for my own ragged breathing. I crept toward the door, gripping the lamp so tightly my hands were shaking. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of my laptop screen in the bedroom. Then I saw it. A shadow, impossibly tall and thin, stretched across the wall. It wasn't moving, but it was wrong, elongated and jagged, like the silhouette of something trying to mimic a human form, but failing miserably. My grip on the lamp tightened. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The shadow twitched, and then, in a blur of movement, it was gone. I don't remember much of what happened next. It was chaos. 1 second, I was standing in the hallway, and the next, the shadow was on me. Not the creature itself, just its shadow. It moved like smoke, wrapping around me, suffocating me. I tried to scream, but the air was heavy, thick, like I was drowning. The symbols I'd seen on its body flashed in my mind, burning like a brand. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. When I opened my eyes, the apartment was empty again. The creature was gone. The window was shattered. The laptop screen was dark, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic outside. But I wasn't alone. Sitting in the middle of the room, surrounded by shards of glass, was a single piece of paper. I crawled toward it, my hands trembling as I picked it up. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, and covered in the same symbols I'd seen on the shard. But in the center, scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting, were 3 words: "It's not over." The note was heavy in my hands, far heavier than it had any right to be. It felt like holding a death sentence. 3 simple words, scrawled in jagged handwriting that practically carved itself into the paper. "It's not over." My mind was screaming at me to get rid of it, to throw it into the pile of shattered glass and run. But my body wouldn't listen. My fingers tightened around the edges, trembling as I stared at the symbols surrounding the words. They seemed to pulse, almost alive, shifting and rearranging themselves as I looked at them. Then my apartment lights flickered. It wasn't just a power surge. The flicker wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like something was trying to get my attention. My eyes darted toward the hallway, where the overhead light was blinking in an almost hypnotic pattern. On off, on off, on off. And then, for a split second, the light stayed off. When it came back on, I wasn't alone. Standing at the end of the hallway was the thing from the stream. It was just standing there, impossibly still, its featureless face tilted toward me. Its long, jagged arms hung at its sides, but its fingers twitched, as though they were itching to move. I backed up, the note crumpling in my hand. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The thing tilted its head, and for a moment, I thought it wouldn't respond. But then it moved, its limbs jerking unnaturally, almost like a marionette being yanked around by invisible strings. Slowly, deliberately, it raised one of its long fingers and pointed, not at me, but at the shattered laptop on my desk. I didn't understand at first. My brain was too scrambled, too consumed by fear to process what it wanted. But then the laptop screen flickered back to life, and the stream was there again, as if it had never stopped. This time, the feed was no longer showing the control room or the object in space. It was showing me. The view was from my bedroom. The camera, or whatever was filming, was pointed directly at me, its grainy lens capturing every shaky breath, every twitch of my hands. I whipped my head around, scanning the room for a camera, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the creature, which was now standing in the center of the hallway, its head still tilted toward me. The lights began flickering faster now, casting the thing in a strobe-like glow that made it seem even more grotesque. Its limbs were impossibly long, its movements jerky and chaotic as it began to inch toward me. I tried to scream, but my throat closed up. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, to do something, but my body refused to move. The creature stopped just a few feet away from me. Its shadow stretched across the walls, impossibly large and distorted, like it was consuming the entire room. Then, for the first time, it leaned down, its faceless void of a head hovering inches from mine, and it spoke. "You've seen it now." Its voice wasn't loud, but it felt deafening. It wasn't coming from its mouth. Hell, it didn't even have a mouth. The sound came from everywhere, vibrating through my skull, my chest, even my teeth. You shouldn't have looked, but you did. And now, it knows you. My mind was spinning. What? What knows me? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the ringing in my ears. The creature tilted its head again, as if amused by the question. Then it raised one of its long, spindly fingers and pressed it against my forehead. The moment it touched me, everything went dark. I don't know how long I was out, but when I opened my eyes, I was lying on the floor. My head was pounding, My ears were ringing, and my entire body felt like it had been hit by a truck. The creature was gone. The laptop was gone. Hell, even the shards of glass from the broken window were gone. It was like nothing had happened. But as I sat up, trying to piece everything together, I noticed something that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. The symbols. They were everywhere, carved into the walls, etched into the floor, even scrawled across my skin, my arms, my legs, my chest. All of it was covered in the same intricate patterns I'd seen on the shard and on the creature. And then I heard it, a low, humming noise, faint at first, but growing louder by the second. It wasn't coming from inside the apartment. It was coming from outside. I staggered to the window, my legs barely holding me up, and looked out into the night. That's when I saw it. The shard. It was no longer in space. It was here, hovering above the city, its massive, jagged form blocking out the stars. The symbols on its surface were glowing now, pulsing in the same rhythm as the patterns carved into my skin. And as I stood there, staring up at it, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The shard wasn't just hovering, it was alive, and it was looking for me. The humming grew louder, almost deafening now, and the ground beneath me began to shake. I could see people down in the streets, pointing up at the sky, their faces twisted in confusion and terror. But none of them mattered, because the shard wasn't here for them. It was here for me. I don't remember much after that, just flashes, the shard descending, the symbols on my skin burning like fire, and a voice, its voice, echoing in my head. You shouldn't be here. When I woke up, I was lying in a hospital bed. The doctors said I'd been found unconscious in my apartment, but they couldn't explain the burns on my skin. They said they'd never seen anything like it. Neither had I. The shard was gone. The symbols were gone. But every night since, I've heard the humming in my dreams. And every morning, I wake up with the same 3 words etched into my mind. It's not over. I don't know who's reading this, or if this will even stay up for long. But if you're smart, if you have even an ounce of self-preservation, don't look for the stream. Don't go down the rabbit hole. Because once you've seen it, it sees you too. I found a dark web guide discussing secret labs in Russia. One of the coordinates matched an abandoned factory in my hometown. You ever do something out of pure boredom that you instantly regret? That's how this started. It was a Friday night, and I was sitting in my room, scrolling through TikTok for hours, feeling like my brain was melting. Everyone I knew was either out of town, working late, or hanging out with their significant others. I was alone, with an open laptop and too much curiosity for my own good. I'd seen those YouTube videos, the ones about exploring the deep web, people finding creepy stuff, urban legends, whatever. Most of it felt like a bunch of exaggerated clickbait, but something about it was fascinating. There's this weird part of me that likes poking at the edge of what's normal, even if it freaks me out. So, after a couple of clicks and a Reddit thread about the dark web basics, I downloaded Tor, set up a VPN, and opened a door I probably should have kept shut. The first few sites I came across weren't anything special. Black market shops, dodgy forums, and a bunch of services that were way out of my comfort zone. But then I found this one page, and it was different. It didn't look like a marketplace or a forum. It was simple, just a black background with white text at the top that read, Project Archive, Locations, and Experiments. underneath that, there was a long scrollable list of coordinates. Some of them had descriptions next to them. Things like biological specimen research, Novosibirsk, or restricted access, psychological testing, Minsk. A lot of them were just labeled classified. And then there were the timestamps. Recent ones too, like some of these places were still active. I wasn't planning on messing with any of it. I figured it was some kind of elaborate roleplay or hoax. But then I saw one coordinate near the bottom of the page, and my blood ran cold. It was in my hometown. No title, no description, just a random set of numbers. Out of curiosity, I copied it and pasted it into Google Maps. When the map loaded, I felt that sick twist in my stomach, like when you realize you've seen something you weren't supposed to. The coordinates pointed to an abandoned factory less than 10 minutes from where I live. I knew the place well. Everyone in town did. It's this old, crumbling building on the edge of the industrial district, completely overrun with weeds and graffiti. It's been shut down for decades. I'd always heard rumors about it. Typical small town stuff, like how it used to make toxic chemicals, or how people had died in some freak accident. Once, someone swore they'd seen strange lights coming from inside at night, but nobody took them seriously. Seeing it listed on this weird guide, it made the place feel different. Office. Like maybe those rumors weren't so far-fetched after all. I sat there staring at the screen, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe the site was a joke. Maybe someone just picked random locations. But if that was true, why did they bother with timestamps and experiments? And why here? My hometown isn't exactly the center of anything, just a quiet, boring spot in the middle of nowhere. The more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to check it out. I know, classic horror story logic. Hey, something creepy happened. Let me run straight toward it. But honestly, I wasn't even thinking about danger. I was too busy trying to figure out what the hell was going on. I told myself I'd just drive by. You know, see if there was anything unusual about the factory. Take a look around from a safe distance and call it a night. No harm in that, right? I didn't plan on going inside. Let me just put that out there. I was only going to check the place out from the outside, like drive by, maybe park for a second to see if anything looked weird, and then head back home. But of course, nothing ever goes that smoothly. It was close to midnight when I finally pulled into the factory's crumbling parking lot. The air was heavy with that damp, metallic smell you get around old buildings, like rust and decay had seeped into the ground itself. The factory looked even worse than I remembered. The brick walls were crumbling, vines crawling up through the cracks, and a bunch of the windows were either boarded up or smashed. There was graffiti everywhere, most of it random tags, but some of it was unsettling. Stuff like giant red handprints or words in a language I didn't recognize. The weirdest part? There wasn't a single sound. No cars on the nearby road, no crickets, no wind. Just this crushing silence that felt way too loud, if that makes sense. I parked my car in the shadow of a half-dead tree and turned off the engine. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or the creeping sense of dread that was settling in my chest. I didn't even want to get out of the car at first. I just sat there, staring at the factory, trying to convince myself this was stupid and I should go home. But then I noticed something, a light. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no. There was definitely a faint glow coming from one of the factory's second-story windows. It wasn't flickering like a flashlight or fire. It was steady, cold, almost bluish, like the glow from a screen. The place was supposed to be abandoned. There shouldn't have been anyone in there. I grabbed my phone and took a quick video of the building, zooming in on the glowing window. I don't know why. Maybe it was to prove to myself later that this actually happened, or maybe it was just a reflex. But as I was recording, something moved. It was fast, so fast I almost didn't catch it. But I swear, I saw a shadow pass across the window, blocking the light for just a split second. That's when I made my first mistake. I should have left right then and there. But no. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight from the glove box and stepped out of the car. The air felt heavier the second my feet hit the cracked asphalt, like it was pressing down on my chest. I kept telling myself I'd just look around for a couple of minutes and leave. The front entrance was chained shut, which was a small relief, honestly. But as I walked along the side of the building, I found a broken section of chain link fence leading to a rusted side door that was slightly ajar. Something about that door didn't sit right with me. The way it was open just wide enough for someone to slip through, but not wide enough to seem casual. It felt like an invitation. I hesitated, shining my flashlight into the gap. The beam caught the edge of what looked like an old, rusted staircase leading down into a basement. That's when I heard it. This faint, metallic scraping noise coming from somewhere deep inside. It sounded almost like dragging, like something heavy being pulled across a concrete floor. Every instinct I had screamed at me to leave, but my curiosity wouldn't let me. I slipped through the door and into the factory. The air inside was freezing, and the smell hit me immediately, like mold, rust, and something else I couldn't place. Something sour, almost like decaying meat. My flashlight flickered as I moved down the staircase, each step groaning under my weight. The scraping noise was louder now, rhythmic, like it was coming from somewhere far below. The basement was massive, bigger than I expected, with rows of broken machinery and pipes running along the ceiling. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing endlessly. I could see old papers and folders scattered across the floor, most of them soaked and illegible. And then there were the cages. They were lined up along the far wall, big industrial ones, like the kind you'd see in some kind of animal testing lab. Most of them were empty, but one of them still had something inside. I walked closer, shining my light into the cage. At first, I thought it was a pile of rags, but then I realized it was fur. A dead animal, or what was left of one, was crumpled in the corner of the cage. Its body was twisted in a way that didn't seem natural, like its bones had been rearranged. The fur was matted with blood, and its eyes, or what was left of them, were staring straight at me. I backed away, trying not to gag, when I heard it again, the scraping noise. But this time, it was closer. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The sound was coming from a hallway to my left, a dark, narrow corridor that seemed to stretch on forever. I don't know why I didn't run. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was that sick curiosity again, but I started moving toward the noise. The walls of the hallway were lined with more graffiti, symbols that looked almost mathematical, like formulas, but twisted. I passed doors with rusted out locks, some of them with scratch marks gouged deep into the metal. The scraping was louder now, and it wasn't just one sound. It was joined by something else, this low, guttural breathing, like whoever or whatever was making that noise was struggling to pull air into its lungs. Finally, I reached the end of the hallway. There was a large metal door, slightly ajar, with light spilling out from the crack. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out, but I pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. What I saw made my stomach drop. The room was full of tables, long metal slabs stained with things I didn't want to think about. Strapped to one of the tables was a person, or at least I think it was a person. Their limbs were bent at impossible angles, their skin pale and stretched too tight, like something had inflated them from the inside. Their head twitched, but their eyes were vacant, staring straight at the ceiling. And standing over them was something. It looked human at first, wearing a lab coat, gloves, all that, but its movements were wrong, jerky, like a puppet on strings. Its head snapped toward me, and I swear its eyes didn't look human. They were too big, too dark, like black holes. Before I could react, it moved, faster than anything I'd ever seen, lunging toward the door. I ran. I didn't look back. Not once. I don't even think I could have if I wanted to. My brain wasn't processing anything except run. The sound of heavy, frantic footsteps echoed behind me, growing louder with every step. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't walking. It was sprinting, and it was fast. The flashlight in my hand was useless now, shaking so badly I could barely aim it in front of me. The beam bounced off the grimy walls, casting distorted shadows that made everything feel alive. My lungs were burning as I bolted back down the hallway, past the cages, the twisted graffiti, and the broken machinery. And then I tripped. My foot caught on a piece of loose metal, and I went down hard. The flashlight flew from my hand and smashed against the floor, the bulb shattering. Darkness swallowed me whole. The sound of footsteps stopped, but the breathing didn't. It was closer now, wet and guttural, like whatever was chasing me was dragging air through a throat that wasn't built for it. I pressed myself against the floor, too scared to even breathe, listening as it moved just a few feet behind me. Then I heard the scratching. At first, I thought it was nails against the concrete, but it wasn't. It was sharper, like metal claws scraping the floor, slow and deliberate. I could feel the vibrations of each scratch through the ground, moving closer and closer. I reached blindly for the flashlight, my fingers brushing against the shards of broken glass. The sharp edges cut into my skin, but I barely noticed. My hand closed around the cold metal of the flashlight's body, and I swung it behind me as hard as I could. The sound it made when it connected wasn't human. There was a crack, followed by a wet, gargled screech that made my stomach turn. I scrambled to my feet in the darkness and ran toward where I thought the staircase was, my heart hammering so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I don't know how I found the stairs, but when my hand hit the rusted railing, I practically threw myself up the steps. The air grew colder as I ascended, and the metallic stench of the basement was replaced by something far worse. The smell of blood. It hit me like a wall as I reached the top of the stairs, my foot landing in something wet. I aimed my phone's flashlight down, and what I saw almost made me throw up. The floor was slick with blood, so much of it that it was pooling in the cracks of the concrete. There were drag marks leading down the hall, like something or someone had been pulled toward the basement. But it wasn't just blood. Scattered across the floor were chunks of flesh, pieces of skin and muscle, shredded like someone had taken a knife to them. A severed hand lay just a few feet away from me, the fingers curled into a claw. I covered my mouth and forced myself to move. Whatever was down there wasn't alone, and I wasn't sticking around to find out what else was lurking in the shadows. I burst through the side door I'd entered through, gasping for air. The parking lot was empty, the silence outside almost deafening after the chaos of the factory. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. Then I saw the lights. At first, I thought it was headlights, maybe a security guard or some other unlucky soul who'd stumbled onto this nightmare. But as the lights got closer, I realized they weren't coming from a car. They were blue, the same cold, unnatural glow I'd seen in the second-story window. The lights moved in perfect unison, sweeping across the lot like searchlights. I ducked behind my car, my mind racing. They were looking for me. I peeked out from behind the car, just in time to see something emerge from the factory's main entrance. It wasn't the thing that had chased me in the basement. It was taller, more humanoid, but its proportions were wrong. Its arms were too long, its legs bent backward at the knees like a bird's, and its face was featureless. Smooth, pale skin stretched across a skull, with no eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just blank, empty nothingness. But somehow, I could feel it looking at me. It moved with a strange, jerky precision, its head snapping from side to side as it scanned the parking lot. The blue lights seemed to emanate from its chest, casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. I crouched lower, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. My keys were still in my pocket, but the thought of starting the car felt like a death sentence. The noise would give me away instantly, and then it turned toward me. I don't know how it knew I was there, but it did. It started moving, its long, spindly legs carrying it across the lot with terrifying speed. I had maybe 5 seconds before it reached me. With no other options, I grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it as hard as I could toward the far side of the lot. The rock clattered against a rusted dumpster, the sound echoing in the still night. The creature stopped, its head snapping toward the noise. For a moment, it just stood there, completely still. Then it bolted toward the dumpster, its movements so fast they almost blurred. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I jumped into my car, jammed the key into the ignition, and turned it. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas. As I sped out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The creature was standing in the middle of the road watching me. The blue lights dimmed, fading into the darkness as I drove away. When I got home, I locked every door and window and sat in my living room with every light on, trying to process what had just happened. I told myself I'd never go back, never talk about it, never even think about that place again. But the nightmare started that same night, and when I woke up the next morning, there was something new on my phone. A video. It was a recording of me in the factory basement, running down the hallway. The angle was high, like it had been filmed from the ceiling, and at the end of the clip, the camera panned to the metal door I'd peeked through. The thing in the lab coat was staring straight into the camera, its head tilting as if it knew I was watching. Then it smiled. I didn't sleep after seeing that video. How could I? I replayed it 100 times, hoping I'd missed something. A clue, a glitch, anything to prove it wasn't real. But it was real. The timestamp in the corner matched exactly when I'd been in the factory. And that thing, the thing in the lab coat with its grotesque, twitching head, had been watching me. The worst part wasn't even the video itself. It was the fact that I had no idea how it got on my phone. My camera roll was clean before I went to bed, and there were no notifications or uploads, just that one horrifying clip waiting for me when I woke up. I deleted it immediately, but it didn't make me feel any safer. If anything, it made it worse. Because what if deleting it didn't matter? What if they could still see me? For the next 2 days, I didn't leave my apartment. I called out of work, ignored texts from friends, and kept my curtains closed at all times. Every shadow outside my window felt like it was crawling closer, like they were watching. But paranoia does something weird to your brain. At some point, you start convincing yourself that maybe you imagined it all, that maybe it wasn't as bad as you remember. By the 3rd day, I'd almost convinced myself it had to be some kind of prank, a messed up hoax, sure, but not real. I decided to dig deeper. I started with the factory. The place was easy enough to research. It was called Morris Industrial Fabrication, and had been shut down in the early 90s after a chemical fire. A few workers had died, burned alive, according to the old newspaper clippings I found. But there wasn't anything about experiments or secret labs, just a tragic industrial accident. But then I came across something odd. In an old article from a local paper, buried way at the bottom of the page, was a brief mention of Morris Industrial Fabrication being acquired by a Russian conglomerate 6 months before the fire. The name of the company was in Cyrillic, so I ran it through Google Translate. It translated to Cryonic Systems. That name hit me like a punch to the gut. It was the same name I'd seen on the dark web guide. One of the experiments listed next to a set of coordinates in Siberia had been labeled Cryogenic Research, Cryonic Systems. My stomach dropped. This wasn't some random prank or local ghost story. It was connected. Whatever Cryonic Systems was, they had something to do with the factory. I decided to look into the coordinates again. The guide I'd found on the dark web was gone, either taken down or moved. No matter what I searched for, I couldn't find it. But I remembered enough of the descriptions to start piecing things together. A lot of the locations on the list were in isolated areas, forests, mountains, abandoned towns. Some of them were famous for urban legends, like the Dyatlov Pass in Russia or the Black Forest in Germany. But others were in places you'd never think to look. I spent hours digging through news articles, conspiracy forums, even YouTube videos. The more I read, the worse it got. One article talked about hikers disappearing near a set of coordinates in northern Canada. Another mentioned a strange sickness in a remote Alaskan village that matched a site listed as biological testing. And then there were the personal stories, people claiming to have seen things they couldn't explain near these locations, creatures that didn't look human, machines that made sounds you couldn't describe. Every single story ended the same way. The person either disappeared or stopped talking about it entirely. I was in way over my head, but I couldn't stop. My curiosity was like an itch I couldn't scratch, even though I knew it was going to get me killed. That night, I went back to the factory. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe to find some kind of evidence to explain everything, or maybe just to prove to myself that I hadn't lost my mind. But the moment I stepped out of my car, I knew I'd made a mistake. The parking lot wasn't empty this time. There was a black van parked near the entrance, its windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. The engine wasn't running, but the air around it felt wrong. I crouched low and moved toward the building, staying in the shadows. As I got closer, I heard voices, low, muffled, speaking a language I couldn't understand. Russian, maybe? The side door I'd used before was wide open now, the rusted hinges glinting faintly under the moonlight. I crept closer, careful not to make a sound, and peeked inside. The hallway was lit this time, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. The graffiti was still there, but the blood was gone, scrubbed clean. And then I heard it, that same scraping noise from the basement. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. It was louder this time, sharper, like whatever was making it was angry. The voices grew louder too, overlapping now, arguing. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. They were scared. I should have left. I wanted to leave, but something kept pulling me forward, like I wasn't in control of my own body anymore. I followed the voices down the hallway, past the cages and the broken machinery. The air grew colder with every step, and the walls started to feel tighter, like the building itself was closing in on me. When I reached the basement staircase, I stopped. The door at the bottom of the stairs was wide open, light spilling out into the hallway. I could see shadows moving inside, 2, maybe 3 people. One of them was holding something, a syringe, maybe, or a scalpel. And then I saw it, the creature from before. It was strapped to one of the metal tables, its limbs contorted and twitching. But it wasn't fighting, it was laughing. The sound was deep and guttural, like it was coming from somewhere far below the earth. The men around it flinched with every laugh, their voices growing more frantic. I stepped back, my foot hitting a loose piece of metal. The clatter echoed down the hallway, and every head in the room snapped toward me. The thing on the table stopped laughing, and then it smiled. I didn't even have time to react before one of the men shouted something in Russian. A gunshot echoed through the factory, deafeningly loud in the confined space. The bullet slammed into the wall just above my head, sending chunks of concrete flying. I ducked and bolted back down the hallway, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The laughter followed me. It wasn't coming from the men, or even from the creature on the table. It was coming from everywhere, surrounding me, echoing off the walls, overlapping itself like some horrific chorus. Each laugh was different, a mix of deep, guttural growls and high-pitched, childlike giggles. I didn't stop to look back. I couldn't. I just kept running, the factory twisting and turning around me, like some kind of living maze. The hallway seemed longer than before, the lights flickering and casting shadows that danced along the walls. And then, the lights went out. I skidded to a stop, gasping for air. The only light now was from my phone, its weak beam barely piercing the suffocating darkness. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate. Not running, but walking, as if whatever was following me knew I had nowhere to go. I turned a corner and slammed into something solid. For a moment, I thought it was a wall, but then it moved. A hand grabbed my wrist, ice cold and impossibly strong. I screamed and swung my phone around, the light catching a face, or what was left of one. The skin was stretched so thin it looked like it might tear, the eyes sunken deep into hollow sockets. The mouth was twisted into an unnatural grin, teeth sharp and glistening like wet bone. It wasn't one of the men I'd seen in the basement. It was something else entirely. Before I could react, it yanked me forward, its grip like steel. I clawed at its hand, but it was like trying to fight a statue. Its other hand reached for my face, long bony fingers twitching. And then, the lights came back on. For a split second, the hallway was bathed in that harsh, fluorescent glow. I saw everything, the blood smeared along the walls, the torn remnants of clothing scattered across the floor, and the creature standing over me. But it wasn't alone. There were more of them, dozens of them, their grotesque forms hunched and twitching, eyes glinting like black glass. They were packed into the hallway, filling every inch of space, their heads snapping toward me in unison as the light flickered again. I broke free from the creature's grip and ran. The laughter was deafening now, overlapping with the sound of footsteps, hundreds of them coming from every direction. I sprinted toward the exit, the air growing colder with every step. My vision blurred, tears streaming down my face as I gasped for breath. When I finally burst through the side door and into the parking lot, I didn't stop. The black van was gone, but I didn't care. I threw myself into my car, fumbling with the keys as the laughter grew louder, spilling out of the factory and into the night. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the lot, my tires screeching against the asphalt. I didn't look back. I couldn't. When I got home, I locked every door and window, shoved furniture in front of the entrances, and sat in the corner of my living room, clutching a kitchen knife. The silence was unbearable, every creak of the building making me flinch. And then my phone buzzed. I didn't want to look. I knew whatever was on the screen would only make things worse, but my hand moved on its own, trembling as I unlocked it. It was a live feed. The video was grainy, but I recognized the setting immediately. It was my apartment. The angle was high, like a security camera, pointed directly at where I was sitting. My stomach dropped as I watched myself on the screen, sitting frozen in the corner of the room. But then, something changed. In the video, the door behind me opened. I whipped around, knife in hand, but the door was still locked. I checked the feed again, and that's when I saw it. A figure stepped into the room, its face obscured by the shadows. It moved slowly, deliberately, its head tilting as if it were studying me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't a man. It was one of them. In the video, it reached out toward me, its fingers long and skeletal, but in reality, there was nothing there. The room was empty, silent, except for the pounding of my heart. And then the video cut to black. For the next few weeks, I didn't leave my apartment. I barely ate, barely slept, jumping at every sound and shadow. I smashed every electronic device I owned, thinking maybe that would stop them from watching me. But the nightmares didn't stop. Every night I dreamed of the factory, of the thing in the lab coat, of the laughter, and every time I woke up, I swore I could still hear it, faint and echoing, like it was coming from somewhere deep below me. A month later, the factory burned down. It was in the news. Accidental fire destroys abandoned building, they called it. But I knew better. They were covering it up, erasing the evidence. But I'm still here, and they're still watching. I hear them sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet. The laughter, faint and distant, but always there. I don't know what they are or what they want, but I know one thing for sure. They're not done with me. This was my last update. If you don't hear from me again, don't look for me. Don't look for the factory. And whatever you do, don't try to find them. I paid for a dark web map, claiming to track unexplored cave systems. The closest cave to me had a tunnel that was blocked by steel doors. Alright, so I've been down a few rabbit holes on Reddit before, but nothing like this. I'm not really the thrill seeker type, but a few weeks ago, I got caught up watching videos on YouTube about unexplored cave systems. You know the ones, where some guy in a GoPro squeezes through claustrophobic tunnels and somehow doesn't have a panic attack. Anyway, that led to me lurking in a subreddit for urban explorers. People would share these insane photos of old subway systems, forgotten bunkers, stuff like that. But one post caught my eye. Someone claimed to have found a map of uncharted cave systems through the dark web. And the kicker? The caves supposedly led to places humans were never meant to see. Now, I've always been skeptical of anything involving the dark web. Like, I'm aware it's mostly just shady marketplaces and scam artists. But curiosity got the better of me. So, yeah, I decided to look into it. I won't bore you with the details of how I got access, but let's just say there's a surprising amount of Reddit threads explaining how to safely navigate the dark web. I found a marketplace selling custom maps for locations all over the world. One listing stood out to me. Deep systems, unmapped caves, and unexplored passages. Includes GPS coordinates and classified notes from underground explorers. $200 in Bitcoin. I mean, come on. Who even writes like that? It screamed scam. But the reviews seemed legit, or at least as legit as reviews on the dark web get. People were saying stuff like, found a tunnel system near me. Freaky, but worth it. And the map led me to a cave with weird structures. Buyer beware. I figured, worst case scenario, I'd blow $200 on nothing. But the best case scenario, I'd have an excuse to drag some friends on an adventure, or at the very least, post some cool pics on Instagram. So, yeah, I bought it. About an hour later, I got a message with a download link and a warning. Do not share this file. For personal use only. If found sharing, you'll be blacklisted from future purchases. The file was a detailed PDF, complete with GPS coordinates, maps, and notes on caves in my area. It didn't look sketchy at all. Like, this thing had legit diagrams and geological details that I couldn't even begin to fake. There were 12 locations listed within a 200-mile radius of me. Most of them were marked as inaccessible or flooded, but one stood out. Cave name redacted. Access blocked by steel door. Warning, possible hazard. The cave was only about an hour's drive away from my place, just outside of a small hiking area that wasn't super popular. I should have stopped there. I mean, steel doors? Possible hazard. That's every horror movie red flag rolled into one. But I convinced myself it was probably just some old mine or something, locked up to keep out stupid kids. And I wasn't planning to do anything illegal. I just wanted to check it out. The drive. The next day, I packed up some essentials. Water, flashlight, gloves, and my trusty GoPro. Because why not document the adventure, right? I didn't tell anyone where I was going, which, in hindsight, was mistake number one. The drive was uneventful. Just long stretches of empty road, and the occasional billboard advertising some tourist trap. I pulled into the small gravel parking lot of the hiking area around 3 p.m. There was one other car parked there, a beat-up Subaru, but no sign of its owner. I followed the map's directions through a series of poorly marked trails until I reached a small clearing. At first, I thought I'd taken a wrong turn because it just looked like a pile of rocks against a hill. But then I saw it, a faint trail leading into what looked like a collapsed entrance. I climbed over the rocks and found myself staring at a narrow tunnel. The air inside was noticeably cooler, and there was this faint metallic smell, like rusted iron. About 20 feet in, I saw the steel doors. The doors, They weren't what I expected. I was picturing something like a rusted gate or old mine doors, but these were clean, industrial looking, with no visible locks or handles, just flat, grey metal that looked completely out of place. There was a small keypad on the right side, but no power. I ran my hand over the surface of the doors, half expecting them to creak open or something, but they didn't budge. The weirdest part? There were scratch marks all over the lower half of the doors, long deep gouges in the metal, like someone or something had been clawing at them. At that point, I started feeling uneasy, like this wasn't some random cave entrance. It felt deliberate. I decided to snap a few photos and head back, but as I was turning around, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small, rusted hatch, about 5 feet to the left of the doors, partially buried under debris. I cleared away some of the rocks and dirt, revealing a circular metal lid, kind of like a manhole cover. It was bolted shut, but one of the bolts was loose. With enough force, I managed to pry it open. The hatch led to a narrow shaft, with a metal ladder disappearing into the darkness below. I shined my flashlight down, but I couldn't see the bottom, just more of that metallic smell, stronger this time. I don't know why I didn't leave right then and there. Call it curiosity, stupidity, whatever. But I climbed in. I don't even know why I climbed down. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or the part of my brain that just refuses to back out of something once I've started. Either way, as soon as I dropped into that hatch and the faint light from above started to fade, I knew I'd screwed up. The ladder felt cold and slick under my gloves, like it hadn't been touched in decades. Every sound I made echoed unnaturally, just the squeak of my boots on metal rungs and my own breathing bouncing off the walls. The shaft itself was tight, barely wide enough for my shoulders, and the smell. It wasn't just metallic anymore. It was damp, sour, and something else I couldn't place. Like rotting meat, but faint. About 20 feet down, my flashlight started catching glimpses of something carved into the walls. At first, I thought it was just scratches, but as I got closer, I realized they were symbols. Weird geometric shapes and spirals, almost hypnotic in the way they looped and connected. Some of them were crudely etched, but others were so precise, it was almost like they'd been done with a machine. I paused to take a picture with my phone, but for some reason, the flash wouldn't work. I snapped a few shots in the dim light anyway, and kept going. After what felt like an eternity, the ladder ended. My feet touched down on cold, damp concrete. The air was heavier down here, thick enough that I had to pull my hoodie over my nose to block out the stench. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow hallway stretching ahead. The walls were smooth concrete, but they were stained with streaks of rust. Or at least, I hoped it was rust. The symbols from the shaft continued here, but they were bigger, more chaotic, like someone had frantically scratched them into the walls with whatever they could find. Every step echoed, and it wasn't long before I started hearing things. Faint noises, like whispers, or maybe just the wind, except there shouldn't be any wind this far underground. At one point, I stopped and held my breath, straining to listen. It sounded like scratching. The hallway eventually opened into a larger chamber. My flashlight barely reached the edges, but I could make out rows of what looked like metal cages, stacked 2 or 3 high against the walls. They were old and rusted, the bars bent in places, but what really got me were the scratches. Every single cage had deep gouges carved into the inside of the bars, as if whatever had been in them was desperate to get out. The concrete floor beneath some of them was stained dark, too dark to be rust. I stepped closer to one of the cages, aiming my flashlight inside. At first, I thought it was empty, but then I saw the bones, a pile of them, small and brittle looking, scattered in the corner. Some of them had been chewed on. My stomach turned, and I backed away, only to trip over something behind me. When I turned around, I almost screamed. It was a shoe. Not just any shoe. It was a modern running sneaker, caked in mud and something darker. The voices. I don't know why, but something about that shoe made it all click. This wasn't just some old abandoned bunker or mine. People had been down here. Recently. The whispers I'd been hearing grew louder, more distinct. They weren't words exactly, more like the sound of someone just barely breathing out syllables. It felt like they were coming from everywhere at once, vibrating in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, or maybe water dripping through the tunnels, but deep down, I knew better. I could feel them, watching, waiting. I pressed on, mostly because the thought of turning back and climbing that ladder again made me just as anxious as whatever lay ahead. The hallway split into two paths, and the map I'd downloaded didn't say anything about a split. I chose the left tunnel because it looked slightly less ominous. The air grew colder as I went, and the walls began to narrow again. About 50 feet in, I noticed something odd. A faint glow coming from up ahead. It wasn't natural light. It was this sickly green color that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I turned off my flashlight and crept forward until I reached the source. It was another room, smaller than the one with the cages, but this one had something even worse. In the center of the room was a table, or at least what was left of one. The wood was splintered, and the metal restraints bolted to its surface were twisted and bent, like someone, or something, had ripped themselves free. The glow was coming from a cracked monitor mounted on the wall, its screen flickering with static. Beneath it was a desk covered in papers and old electronics. The tape. I don't know why I started digging through the papers. I guess I was hoping for some kind of explanation, but all I found were more symbols and diagrams. One of them showed a human figure, surrounded by those spirals, with arrows pointing to different parts of their body. There was also a tape recorder, an actual tape recorder, like something out of the 90s, sitting on the desk next to a stack of tapes. Most of them were unlabeled, but one had the word test scrawled on it in red marker. Against my better judgment, I pressed play. At first, it was just static, but then a voice cut through. It was muffled and distorted, but I could make out a few words. Subject 37, behavior abnormal, restraints ineffective, proceed to phase 2. There was a loud crash in the background, followed by what sounded like screaming. Not human screaming, though. This was guttural, animalistic, like whatever was making the noise didn't have vocal cords meant for speech. I stopped the tape and shoved it into my pocket. My heart was pounding, and every instinct I had was telling me to get out of there. The door, as I turned to leave, my flashlight caught something I hadn't noticed before. A door on the far side of the room. Unlike the steel doors from earlier, this one was smaller, rusted, and slightly ajar. The scratches on the walls around it were deeper here, almost frenzied. There were dark stains smeared across the doorframe, and the faint smell of decay seeped through the crack. I should have left. I know I should have left. But something about that door felt like it was calling me, like I had to see what was on the other side. I reached for the handle, my hands trembling. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, but they weren't coming from the room behind me anymore. They were coming from inside my head. As I pulled the door open, the flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move in the darkness beyond. Something big. And then the door slammed shut on its own, the force knocking me backward. The whispers stopped. That's when I heard it. A low growl coming from the other side of the door. That growl wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't an animal, at least not any animal I could recognize. It was deep, guttural, and wet, like something was snarling through a throat full of mucus. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by something scratching against the rusted door. Not frantic scratching like an animal, but deliberate, almost testing the metal. I slowly backed away, keeping my flashlight pointed at the door. The beam flickered, and for a moment, the room plunged into darkness. My heart stopped. I fumbled with the flashlight, smacking it against my palm until it came back to life. When the light returned, I realized something horrifying. The door wasn't shut anymore. It had cracked open just an inch, but enough for me to see a sliver of the darkness behind it. The escape attempt. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I ran. I didn't even look back. I just bolted through the hallway, retracing my steps as fast as I could. My flashlight swung wildly, the beam bouncing off the walls and casting shadows that looked like they were reaching for me. The whispering was back, louder and more chaotic now. It didn't sound like one voice anymore. It sounded like dozens, maybe hundreds, overlapping and speaking in this language that didn't make any sense. As I rounded a corner, I nearly tripped over something. When I looked down, I saw a trail of fresh blood smeared across the floor. It led into one of the side tunnels I hadn't explored yet. I forced myself to ignore it and kept moving. My only goal was to get back to the ladder and climb out of this nightmare. I was maybe 30 feet from the shaft when the growling started again, this time from somewhere behind me. It was closer now, and it wasn't alone. I could hear multiple sets of footsteps, heavy, uneven, like whatever was back there wasn't walking but dragging itself forward. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and for the first time, I saw them. There were 3 of them, hunched and misshapen, their pale skin glistening in the dim light. They moved like they weren't used to their own bodies, their limbs jerking and twisting with every step. Their faces, or what was left of them, were warped, almost melted looking, with hollow eye sockets that seemed to track me even in the dark. The lead one let out this high-pitched screech that made my ears ring, and suddenly, they were running. The ladder. I reached the ladder just as the first one lunged at me. Its clawed hand swiped at my leg, catching my jeans and ripping a gash in the fabric. I screamed and scrambled up the ladder, my GoPro bouncing against my chest as I climbed. The things weren't fast, but they were relentless. I could hear them clawing at the metal below me, their screeches echoing up the shaft. One of them grabbed the bottom rung and started pulling itself up. By the time I reached the top, my arms were shaking so badly I could barely lift myself out of the hatch. I kicked the cover back into place and shoved as many rocks and debris over it as I could find. For a moment, everything was silent except for the sound of my own breathing. Then, I heard the scratching again. It was faint, but it was there, coming from beneath the hatch. The messages, I didn't stop running until I was back in my car. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get the keys into the ignition. As soon as the engine roared to life, I peeled out of the parking lot and didn't look back. When I finally got home, it was almost midnight. My clothes were soaked in sweat, and my leg was bleeding from where that thing had ripped my jeans. I grabbed my phone to check the photos I'd taken, hoping I'd captured something that could explain what I'd just been through. But when I opened my gallery, the pictures were gone. Every single one, gone. Even the ones I'd taken earlier, before I'd gone down the hatch. It didn't make sense. That's when I noticed the first message. It wasn't a text or an email. It was a notification from an app I didn't recognize. The icon was just a blank circle, and the notification read, "We warned you not to share." I clicked on it, but the app wouldn't open. The notification disappeared, and the app icon vanished from my phone. I tried to shrug it off as some kind of glitch, but then my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo. It was the shoe I'd seen in the cage room, except now it was sitting on my doorstep. The visitor. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise, every creak in my apartment made me jump. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps outside my window, but when I checked, there was nothing there. The next morning, I found another photo on my phone. This one showed the hatch I'd sealed, but the rocks and debris were gone. The hatch was wide open. I decided to call the cops, but what was I supposed to say? That I'd broken into a mysterious underground bunker and found monsters. That someone, or something, was stalking me. Instead, I just locked all my doors and windows and stayed inside, hoping this would all blow over. The breaking point. A few days later, I woke up to a loud banging on my front door. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and crept toward the sound. The banging stopped, and when I looked through the peephole, there was no one there. But when I opened the door, I found something waiting for me. A single piece of paper with one word scrolled across it in red ink. Downstairs. I don't even have a downstairs. That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to stop. Whatever I'd stumbled into, it wasn't just going to let me go. I decided to go back. I know how insane that sounds, but I couldn't keep living like this, jumping at shadows, waiting for something to happen. If this thing wanted me, I'd face it on my terms. I packed a bag with supplies, water, rope, a crowbar, and my dad's old hunting knife. I left my phone on the counter and drove back to the cave. When I reached the hatch, it was open, just like in the photo. The ladder was slick with something wet, and the smell was worse than ever. As I climbed down, I realized something had changed. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and the symbols on the walls were glowing faintly, pulsing like they were alive. At the bottom of the shaft, I found a new message scratched into the concrete floor. Welcome back. The moment I stepped off the ladder, I felt it. The heavy, oppressive air that seemed to press against my skin like invisible hands. It was different this time. Thicker, heavier, like the whole place was alive and breathing. The faint glow from the symbols on the walls pulsed steadily, almost like a heartbeat, casting eerie green light across the tunnels. The message on the floor, "Welcome back," was fresh. Jagged scratches in the concrete, with small flecks of blood crusted around the edges. I didn't want to think about what kind of thing might have carved it. I gripped my crowbar tightly and started moving down the hallway, my footsteps echoing louder than they should have. It felt like every sound I made was being amplified, broadcast to whatever was waiting for me in the dark. The cages in the larger room were still there, but now the bones were gone. Every single one. The cages were empty except for the claw marks on the bars and the faint stains on the floor. That's when I realized something chilling. The shoe that had been in one of the cages was gone too. The green corridor. The hallway beyond the cage room had changed. The walls were no longer smooth concrete. They were rough, jagged, and veined with the glowing green light. The patterns in the walls looked less like carvings and more like they'd grown there, twisting and curling in unnatural shapes. My flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, and every time I swung it to one side, I swore I saw movement in the corners of my vision. It was subtle, a flicker of something darting out of the beam, just fast enough to make me second-guess myself. The whispers were louder now, distinct enough that I could almost make out words. They weren't in English, but they had this rhythmic, chanting quality that made the hairs on my neck stand up. After what felt like hours, I reached another door. This one wasn't rusted or industrial like the others. It was carved directly into the stone, with strange grooves and patterns radiating outward like a spider web. The glow from the symbols pulsed brighter here, almost blinding. There was something wet smeared across the surface of the door. When I leaned in closer, I realized it wasn't paint. It was blood, still fresh enough to drip onto the floor. I didn't want to open it. Everything in my body was screaming at me to turn around and run, but the whispers were louder than ever, almost like they were coming from behind the door. And then it swung open on its own. The ritual room. I can't even describe what I saw in that room without feeling sick. The space was massive, far larger than should have been possible, given how deep underground I was. The walls were lined with what looked like black stone pillars, each carved with symbols that seemed to move when I looked directly at them. In the center of the room was a pit, circular and about 10 feet across, filled with a thick, bubbling liquid that glowed faintly green. The smell was overwhelming, rotten and chemical at the same time, like burning flesh and spoiled milk. Suspended above the pit was a body. At least, I think it was a body. It was hard to tell because it had been skinned almost entirely, the raw muscle glistening under the green light. The limbs were twisted, unnaturally long, and the head lolled to one side as if it had been snapped. The thing wasn't just hanging, it was being lowered. Thin, spindly wires descended from the ceiling, slowly dragging the body down toward the pit, and then it started moving. The screaming body. At first, it was just a twitch, a jerk of the hand, or a spasm in one of the legs. But then its head snapped up, and its mouth opened wide in a silent scream. I swear, I could see the muscles in its throat flexing, even though no sound came out. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the pit itself. The liquid began to churn violently, splashing against the edges and hissing like acid. I backed away, keeping my flashlight on the scene, but as soon as I took a step, the body's head twisted toward me. Its hollow eye sockets locked onto me, and it started thrashing against the wires, trying to free itself. That's when I heard the footsteps. The things in the dark. They were coming from the hallway behind me. Heavy, uneven steps, accompanied by the same wet growling I'd heard earlier. I turned my flashlight toward the entrance, just in time to see one of the creatures lurch into the room. It was worse up close. Its pale, rubbery skin glistened with moisture, and its face was just a mess of melted features. No eyes, no nose, just a wide, gaping mouth full of jagged teeth. The way it moved was jerky and wrong, like a marionette being controlled by someone who didn't know how to work the strings. and it wasn't alone. More of them shuffled into the room, their hollow sockets staring at me as if they could see me despite having no eyes. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I bolted for the other side of the room, skirting the edge of the pit. The things didn't chase me at first. They just stood there, twitching and watching. But as soon as I reached the far wall, I heard the first one let out that same bone-rattling screech, and then they were coming for me. The doorway. There was another door on the far side of the room, carved into the same black stone as the pillars. I didn't have time to think. I just threw myself at it, slamming my crowbar into the seam until it finally creaked open. The hallway beyond was different from the others. It was narrow, almost claustrophobic, and the walls were covered in what looked like veins. Thick, pulsing veins that oozed black liquid when I brushed against them. The whispers were back, louder than ever, and this time I could hear something else beneath them. Laughter. Not normal laughter, though. This was high-pitched and manic, like a child giggling in the middle of a nightmare. The ending I didn't choose. I don't know how long I ran through that tunnel. Time didn't feel real anymore. My legs were screaming. My lungs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't stop. The laughter and whispers followed me, growing louder and louder until I thought my head would explode. And then, suddenly, the tunnel ended. I stumbled into a small, circular room with a single object in the center. A mirror. It was massive, nearly as tall as the ceiling, and its surface wasn't reflective. It was black, like polished obsidian. As I approached, I realized I wasn't alone. My reflection was there, but it wasn't me. It was smiling. The whispers stopped. My reflection raised a hand and pointed at me, its grin widening until its mouth stretched unnaturally wide. Then the room went dark. The blackness around me wasn't just the absence of light. It was absolute. A suffocating, oppressive void that made it impossible to tell where my body ended and the air began. The only thing I could see was the mirror, or whatever that thing was. My reflection stood there, grinning at me, with teeth that weren't mine. It moved when I didn't. Its head tilted to the side, slow and deliberate, like it was studying me. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My legs were rooted to the spot, and my arms hung useless at my sides. Then it spoke. The voice didn't come from the reflection. It came from everywhere. It was layered, like 100 different versions of my own voice, speaking at once, all slightly out of sync. You shouldn't have come back. The reflection raised a hand, its fingers stretching unnaturally long, and pressed it against the glass. The surface rippled like water, and I swear I felt the pressure of it against my chest, even from several feet away. And then it stepped out. The moment it left the mirror, the room exploded with sound. The whispers, the laughter, the growling. It all came rushing back, deafening and chaotic. My knees buckled, and I fell to the floor, clutching my head. When I looked up, it was standing over me. The thing that wore my face. It wasn't me anymore. The smile was too wide, the eyes too dark, the body too thin, like it had been stretched out. Its head twitched slightly, as if it were trying to mimic human movements, but couldn't quite get it right. I scrambled backward, my hand brushing against something cold and sharp. The hunting knife. I didn't remember dropping it, but it was there, and I grabbed it without hesitation. The thing tilted its head again, watching me like I was some kind of fascinating experiment. Then it crouched down, moving with this horrifying, insect-like precision, and whispered, "Do you want to see what's behind the door?" It didn't wait for an answer. The thing grabbed my wrist with a strength that didn't make sense for something so thin. Its grip was ice cold, and its touch sent this electric jolt through my arm, like every nerve was being fried at once. I screamed and swung the knife, slashing wildly at its face. The blade connected, but instead of cutting, it just sank in. The skin rippled like liquid, and the wound closed the moment I pulled the knife away. The thing didn't react. It just stared at me, unblinking, as if the attack had confirmed something it already suspected. Then it yanked me to my feet and dragged me toward the far wall. The second door. I hadn't seen the door before. It was identical to the one that had led me into the room, except this one was covered in symbols that pulsed faintly, like veins under skin. The thing shoved me forward, and the door creaked open on its own. A gust of warm, putrid air hit me, and I gagged. The room beyond was pitch black, but the whispers were louder than ever, almost desperate now. The thing didn't follow me. It just stood there, smiling that awful smile, and said, "It's waiting for you." And then it slammed the door shut behind me. The room. The darkness in this room was different, alive. I could feel it pressing against me, sliding over my skin, slipping into my ears and nose. It felt like being smothered, but there was no escape. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me with only the faint, sickly glow of the symbols on the walls. They pulsed faster now, the light growing brighter and dimmer in rhythm with my heartbeat. And then I heard it, a low, guttural breathing that came from somewhere in the dark. It wasn't like the growling from before. This was slower, heavier, like the sound of something massive struggling to contain itself. I didn't want to move, but the whispers were relentless, urging me forward. I took a step, then another, until my foot hit something soft. I looked down and almost vomited. It was a body, or at least what was left of one. The skin was pale and torn, and the torso had been completely hollowed out, the ribs bent outward like something had burst out. The breathing grew louder, and I realized the body wasn't alone. There were dozens of them, scattered across the floor, each one mutilated in a different way. Some were skinned, others dismembered, and a few were so mangled I couldn't even tell if they'd been human. And then they started moving. The crawl. It started with a twitch. One of the bodies jerked, its hand clawing weakly at the ground. Then another body moved, and another, until all of them were writhing and crawling toward me. Their eyes, if they still had eyes, were wide and glassy, and their mouths opened and closed, like they were trying to scream, but couldn't. The whispers in the room shifted, becoming more frantic, almost screaming themselves. I backed away, swinging my flashlight like a weapon, but it was useless. The bodies kept coming, dragging themselves across the floor, their broken limbs twisting unnaturally. One of them grabbed my ankle, its fingers cold and sticky, and I screamed. I kicked at it, the sole of my boot crunching against its face, but it didn't let go. That's when I saw it, the thing in the pit, in the center of the room, where the bodies were converging. The floor began to crack. Black liquid oozed through the fractures, pooling and bubbling like tar. And then it rose. The thing that emerged from the pit wasn't human, wasn't animal. It was something else entirely. Its body was an ever-shifting mass of black tendrils and limbs, and its head was a writhing tangle of flesh and bone, with too many mouths and too many eyes. It didn't move toward me. It didn't have to. The bodies were dragging me toward it, their hands clawing at my legs and arms with unnatural strength. I screamed and thrashed, but it was no use. The thing opened one of its mouths, and a sound like 1,000 voices crying out in unison filled the room. The end. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was lying in the parking lot near the cave, my clothes torn and covered in blood. My phone was gone, my flashlight was gone, and the hunting knife was broken in half. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing, but unable to form a single coherent thought. When I got back to my apartment, I found another message waiting for me on my kitchen table. It was written in red ink, the same as before. Don't come back. I don't know what that thing was or what it wanted. All I know is that it let me go, and I'm not stupid enough to test my luck again. Edit. I'm done. I'm deleting this account, moving to another state, and trying to forget any of this ever happened. If you ever find a map like the one I bought, don't follow it. Some places are meant to stay hidden. Some doors are meant to stay closed.